and we are recording.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Bahman Azad, the Executive Secretary of the U.S. Peace Council. I have been given the honor of moderating this important webinar with our dear friend, Carlos Ron, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Bolivarian Government of Venezuela. On behalf of the organizer of this webinar, I welcome all of you to this timely gathering. As you are well aware, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the immoral and anti-human nature of the US policy of economic sanctions and regime change. While the whole world is facing an unprecedented level of death and suffering, the US government has decided to weaponize its unilaterally imposed sanctions to push for a forced regime change in countries that refuse to submit to its imperial domination. In late March, in a letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations, 18 countries demanded an end to all sanctions, economic sanctions, and called for a global cooperation of all governments in the face of COVID-19 pandemic. However, instead of heeding this humanitarian call, the US government has intensified its military threats and economic sanctions against a number of countries, including and especially against Venezuela. We all know about the recent US government's baseless charge of drug trafficking against President Maduro and the subsequent deployment of US warships to the shores of Venezuela in the name of the war on drugs. In a more recent move, the Trump administration, instead of releasing Venezuela's frozen assets, plundered another $342 million of Venezuela's frozen funds by illegally transferring them from Venezuela's bank account in Citibank to an account at the US Federal Reserve. Today, we will be hearing from Vice Minister Carlos Ron about all these criminal actions of the US government against the peoples of Venezuela and the Venezuelan people's heroic resistance in the face of US aggression against their country. Before turning the mic to Vice Minister Carlos Ron, I would like to ask my colleague Kevin Zeese, co-director of the Popular Resistance, to make an introductory remark. Kevin, please.
Okay, thank you very much. My responsibility is to provide context in a broader sense for this discussion. I'll start by saying the U.S. has intervened in Latin America since the founding of the country. The U.S. has lived by the Monroe Doctrine, which is basically treating Latin American countries as U.S. sphere of influence. Only the U.S., no European countries were allowed to participate there, and the U.S. has used that to dominate Latin America. And the efforts to dominate Venezuela, in particular, have grown over recent decades since the nation declared its independence from U.S. domination and stood on its own sovereignty when they elected Hugo Chavez as president in 1998. With each president of the United States since then, this intervention has escalated. Under President Trump, U.S. intervention has gotten more extreme, with the refusal to recognize President Maduro after his re-election in 2018. It was an incredibly run election. I was in Venezuela for that election, along with several hundred international election observers who all agreed that it met the standards of democracy under international law. But the U.S. refused to recognize that election, and instead, through their support to a nobody politician, Juan Guaido. And I call him a nobody because he barely won it in the legislature with a small 24% vote. And he's from a minor party in a small state. No one knew who he was, but he declared himself president with US backing. He's advocated for more economic warfare and sanctions against his own people in Venezuela. He's even called for the use of military force against his own country. There have been constant escalations, as Bahman mentioned, to steal Venezuelan resources, including from its corporations like Citgo and its diplomatic properties. People might remember that the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C. was threatened last year. In fact, last year at this time, Margaret Flowers and I, along with about 70 other people, were sleeping in the embassy to protect it from a U.S. coup. It's the first time ever that people in the United States went to an embassy to stop a U.S. coup. Margaret and I are still among the final 4 who were facing federal prosecution for that protection of the embassy. In my visits to Venezuela, we saw people in social movements, various political parties on the streets, and they so appreciated our presence. They wanted us to see the truth about Venezuela because they knew people in the United States were being lied to. In fact, everything we saw in Venezuela showed that we have to doubt all the reporting in Western media and the comments from bipartisan political elected officials in the United States because it's almost all lies. The people in Venezuela really appreciated our solidarity, which led us to offer even greater solidarity in return. That is background to today's webinar. The issue today, we will hear from Carlos Ron. We will hear a perspective from Venezuela on what's happening there and discuss our role as citizens of the US empire, citizens of the United States, that is attacking Venezuela in violation of international law in multiple ways at this crucial time. It is a crucial time. While Venezuela is defending itself and its people, we need to work to stop the economic war, the threats of military attack, and the other escalations. This is a moment of global pandemic, a moment of global economic collapse, and the United States should not be escalating conflict with Venezuela or any country, but we should be working with the world community to confront the crises the people of the world are facing. International solidarity is always important, but in this time of crisis, understanding the important truth that an injury to one is an injury to all is more important than ever. We are all connected in one global community. Thank you all very much for being here. I'll return it to Bahman to introduce our main speaker.
Thank you, Kevin. Now, I'm really honored to introduce to you Carlos Ron, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Venezuela. I would like to thank him for accepting our invitation in these very troubling times to share this time with us and explain to us how people of Venezuela are resisting these US aggressions. Thank you, Carlos, please.
Okay. Ajamu as well. Glad to be able to join you, and you know it's always very difficult for Venezuela to provide its narrative, you know, its own account of what's going on, because we have such a hard media campaign against the Bolivarian government and the whole political process in Venezuela. So having this opportunity is very welcome and very appreciated. So I think what we were asked, what I was asked to talk about in general terms was a bit, you know, where this tension comes from. You know, just a brief background on what has been going on during the last several years between Venezuela and the United States, but also the more recent wave of attacks. And I know we're going to have a little bit of an exchange, which will be helpful as well, so that, you know, I could answer some of the things that are concern you the most. But I would just start by saying, which I think, just to put everything into general context. And, you know, there are many things we could talk about the relationship between the United States and Venezuela during the years of the Bolivarian Revolution. But I think that the most important aspect of why, when you ask why the United States has this obsession, this concern with Venezuela, why it needs to constantly promote regime change in Venezuela, I think we could talk about two really important aspects that are key, and then are not necessarily the only ones, but I think that are fundamental to understanding what's going on. The first one is oil, and that's and you may think it's a given, but if we think about how or what has happened in Venezuela during the last 20 years or so, we were one of those countries that the United States, had under its influence before 1999, and which is pretty much a friendly country, which was one of those countries that didn't give any concerns to the United States geopolitically, because it felt that it was an ally. And it was when the change of government came about with the election that President Chavez won, and with the drafting of a new constitution where there was a lot of input by the people, that we started reevaluating our role and the role of every element in our society. And oil was key to producing a society that really took care of its people. It still is our main source of income. And it was necessary to, start employing that income, not as not like a private company like PDVSA used to do before, but rather, as a motor for the economy and for the improvement of lives of everyone else. And to fulfill the social debt that Venezuela had to its people. So why does this become an issue of concern to the United States? Because first of all, it's the largest oil reserve, the largest proven oil reserve in the world. Second of all, President Chavez began the task of we needed to recover the price of oil, which at the time was about $7 per barrel. And we needed to recover the price of oil so that we could have more income in the country and that we could carry out the social programs that we needed. So the first thing he did was go around and try to rekindle what was OPEC, which at the time was pretty much there's a lot of frictions between different leaders and governments. So there was lack of communication. It wasn't really operating anymore. And there was the idea that we needed. President Chavez said, we need to pick this up again. We need to reconstitute this organization, all the oil producer countries around the world, and we have to talk about how we can improve our situation collectively. And he went around, and this is where he crosses the first lines according to U.S. Foreign policy, because he in order to realign OPEC, he had to make some uncomfortable visits from the U.S. perspective. He had to visit Saddam Hussein. He had to visit Muammar Gaddafi. He went to Iran. He went to the countries that were of concern geopolitically for the United States. Then this starts in 2001, and then we begin a process for the renationalization, basically, of the oil industry. Because until then, it was going in a process of privatization. What was being done, the government's part, was trying to run down the company so that it could be privatized, sold to the private market, and all these companies would come from outside and take care of collect the riches of Venezuela's industry. So by 2007, I'm going to run this fast. We undergo a process of not only did we stop the privatization, but we renationalized, renegotiated many of the contracts that we had, imposing some new terms on companies that didn't want to take them. For example, Exxon was one of the first that went left the country because they didn't want to accept the new terms that were more favorable to the Venezuelan people. And this is where you get this tension, and where Venezuela is using oil as the motor for its development, and it's not it's not doing it. It's doing it in a way that it would help its people, and not in the way that the United States wanted to go. Then comes, after President Chavez passes away in 2013, and President Maduro comes back, I think there was a moment where the State Department and the people that make the foreign policy in the United States realized that this was their now or never moment, at least their first one, because I think we're in another now or never moment, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I think they realized, look, this is the time where prices are starting to come back down again, and Venezuela's weaker, and Chavez, which was a very popular leader, is no longer there. So this is the time we could come back in and take over, the oil resources, and this is the time we can, try to come back. What happened was that during the 2015-16 years, which were very bad for the price of oil, President Maduro started doing the same tactic that President Chavez had done before, and started going also to OPEC countries that started, a movement to try to talk again about how the OPEC countries could help the price of oil come back and strengthen the economy. When that process began, it was when they realized that they couldn't afford another a comeback of the revolution. They needed to do something to weaken it weaken it the most. And it started with, under President Obama, with the issue of the executive order that allowed for the first sanctions to come in against Venezuela. And then once Trump comes into office, it gets even worse. And we can discuss about, also the type of sanctions that we have been looking at here. But just so you get an idea, Venezuela no longer can sell oil to the United States directly. Venezuela can't renegotiate its debt. So in the middle of an economic crisis, it's not allowed to do what any other country would do to try to, buy debt or sell bonds or, do the kind of things that other countries do in order to address their debt. Venezuela can't, we were basically robbed of our parent or sister company in the United States, which was Citgo. It's now under control of the Venezuelan opposition, illegally, of course. And the income that would come from that, the revenue that would come from Citgo, is no longer being able to come back to Venezuela. And Venezuela has been subjected to a terrible financial blockade, which doesn't allow us to make timely purchases of food, medicine, anything. So there's always an argument by the State Department and by the Treasury and everything. Oh no, but these sanctions they don't affect the people. This is not true because we have licenses that allow for the buying and the purchasing of food and so forth. This is not true, and this is not true because once you're blocked financially, it doesn't matter whether you're going to buy, a car or whether you're going to buy a piece of bread. I mean, the transaction just won't go through, and they have complete control over the financial system. So there's a blockade of that system. Banks not only do they do it because they're asked to do so, but they also there's an issue called overcompliance, where banks, in the fear that they're going to get hit with tougher sanctions, they decide that they don't want to deal with the Venezuelan money, and that any accounts that the state has, they should just they don't want to touch them. They just want to they either close. Some of them have closed them. Some of them have frozen our assets and said, once we determine if this is legal money or not, if this is not the product of corruption or whatever, then we can give it back to you. And in that trance, this whole atmosphere, we've ended up with at least $5 billion blocked currently in assets in accounts throughout the world. Again, not necessarily U.S. accounts, but these are accounts at banks that, because they don't want to deal with U.S. sanctions, they decide to block them. Okay, and in the amount of money we have lost, even with Citgo, it runs up to 30 billion easily. If we ask now to make a transaction, then comes this bizarre response that we can make transactions on those accounts because we are no longer the government of Venezuela, because they, State Department, decided that the real president is somebody who's never elected, who proclaims himself president, and who has no, who's not even president of the National Assembly anymore because he lost the election in January. So this is a bizarre context in which we're in as Venezuelans, and that drives us to the second point that I think is key as to why this is going on, and it's because geopolitically Venezuela represents an alternative model that they don't want to deal with. This is an alternative model that cross other red lines as well. Not only, let's forget about the oil for a second, but let's think about the other things that we did. And we're undermining what has been policy for the Western Hemisphere, for the United States, for the last 50 years or so. And this is basically, we were able to establish friendly and cooperation relationship with countries deemed as enemies, for example, Cuba primarily. And and that's important because like I said before, that the current people in charge of the foreign policy of the United States towards Latin America, for some strange reason, they all belong to the same group of people that have ties to the ancient Cuban aristocracy that was there, that was during the dictatorship of Batista before the Cuban Revolution. And they're trying to live out this, Cold War fantasy, where they think that by attacking Venezuela and by achieving, the overthrow of the government of Venezuela, they're going to fulfill what they weren't able to do with Cuba, all those years ago. This is extremely dangerous because these people actually believe this, and they are joined by the neocons, who, who are also very dangerous because they also have their Cold War frustrations, and also because they think that these are the type of people, the neocons, that have made the war for oil the worst for oil that we've seen in the last 20 years or so, and these have been terrible wars, gruesome. They have, where a lot of American people have lost lives, as well as the people in the affected countries. But that it's something that it's a ongoing motor that kind of needs to replenish itself, because it uses oil to propel its advances. By this I mean, the military is one of the key sectors in the United States that still needs oil. I mean, there's a lot of talk now about, well, we're going into maybe into a greener economy, and oil is no longer as important, and look at the, now the prices is falling, so it shouldn't be a big issue anymore. But that's not true for some sectors, and one of these key sectors is the military, because you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I haven't seen a fighter jet fly on solar power or on batteries. I mean, you really need oil to move and have dominations, throughout the world, because you need fossil fuels to do that. So it's the importance of that. Venezuela then had this relationship with Cuba, established relationships with countries such as China, Russia, Iran, countries that were troublesome for the geopolitical strategy of the United States, and it feels that it needs to go back to the Monroe Doctrine principles and tell countries in Latin America who, we should deal with and who we are allowed to have relationships with. And this is a very dangerous concept, but this is something that this administration at least is pushing forward. And just beginning of March, there was a foreign conference where they, openly said, look, we are promoting our Monroe Doctrine 2.0. This is our maximum pressure strategy. And that's sort of what brings us to, what's going on right now. This maximum pressure strategy in the last couple of months has been, again, the second now or never moment. I think now they see that with the pandemic, they feel that Venezuela is not going to be able to deal with both health crisis as well as political destabilization at the same time. So these people are going to this very, very crazy move where they're putting all their efforts in at the same time in order to, force this change of government. How do they think they're going to approach it? How do they think they're going to achieve it? They think that it's going to come because the military or some parts of Chavismo are going to ultimately betray President Maduro and turn against him, and then all of a sudden everybody, moves on. And so what they do is they're using tactics in order to promote those divisions within the Venezuelan government structure. In the recent weeks, they started by doing this ludicrous indictment on March 26th against President Maduro and a whole group of high-ranking government officials, basically accusing them of drug trafficking. Now, it was all in the middle of one of those COVID-19 press conferences that the administration is having. They brought in the whole team and Attorney General and the whole Pentagon. It was like huge, very dangerous, by the way, because of the virus. But there's a huge gathering of people just so that everybody could say how dangerous Nicolás Maduro was, because he was the head of a drug cartel that was trying to, look at this, he was trying to take advantage of the pandemic so that he could flood the United States with drugs and destroy the United States. I mean, this is taken out of a movie almost. If it would be funny if it wasn't so tragic. And then it's very concerning. But funny thing is that you have people even in the liberal establishment, such as the Washington Office for Latin America, WOLA, who came out, and said, well, if you look at the real problems with drug trade from South America to the United States, really the routes that are mostly used, about 80 or some percent, to bring drugs into the United States go through the Pacific Ocean, and Venezuela has no Pacific coast. It itself shows you that this is not, even if it were to be true that this was a point of concern, it was not the main point of concern. And there's proof in the own reports by the Department of Defense about this. So our concern then took another. We were hit with another. We were attacked by another action, which was the United States promoted the issuing of a democratic transition plan. And basically, again, they're resorting to the same old practice that they had, which was to ask for President Maduro to leave, to basically pretend that we're going to violate the Constitution, that we're going to forget the elections that we held in 2018, and basically give up. President Maduro has to give up the government, and they establish a plan of where they would set up a council and have some sort of a co-government between Chavista forces and forces from the back Guaidó, and then somehow everybody's going to get along together, and then that would be fine for the United States. And then afterwards, very afterwards, after they established, they've done that for a year, and we've had another election, and somebody else has been elected, and they approve of those elections, and they, put their observers in, and they decide that, those are acceptable elections. Then they would consider lifting the sanctions. So this is a it's being sold, and you see Elliot Abrams coming out on some of these meetings at the think tanks and saying things like, oh, this is a new approach, and this we're extending this offer. This is a negotiation, but they start from the point that they're basically overthrowing a government. They're taking away capacity of a political movement, of the main political movement in the country, to continue in government, and they pretend that this is something new and that this is something that it could be, minimally acceptable for anyone. Last, they came up with another, in a way, well, we first accuse you, then we give you this sort of, program so that you could accept it and we can negotiate. But if you don't do that, then we send the military in. And they've ordered the largest deployment of U.S. military in the last 30 years to the Caribbean Ocean, again, to the Caribbean Sea, again, not where the main routes of drug trafficking are. And with the purpose of conducting whatever type of operation, and it's something that we don't really understand what it's driving at. But if we look at the history of Latin America, having a military deployment so close to Venezuela is a dangerous, very dangerous situation. Especially from an administration that has often said that they don't rule out a military option for Venezuela. And especially in the middle of a pandemic that the US government hasn't been able to handle, which right now is the epicenter of the pandemic is in the US, with the highest number of deaths around the world, and where we know also a practice of the US government has been, whenever you come into a time where internal politics are not doing well, then you decide that you need to create some sort of distraction, the whack the dog type of scenario. And all of a sudden, this is happening now towards Venezuela. So we're in this very particular situation. Again, this is something that we're facing with our convictions, with our commitment to this deep democratic and revolutionary process. And this is something that we're not gonna, it's not gonna make us change our disposition or change our objectives or change our responsibilities that we have acquired with the Venezuelan people. But it is important for you to understand in the United States that it's a very dangerous situation when the U.S. government, rather than pay attention to its own internal problems, is trying to seek this moment in time to launch this multiform aggression, this hybrid war against Venezuela, and in what they believe is the final attempt so that they could finally get rid of this revolutionary government that is so uncomfortable for them, that gives them so many problems geopolitically, that has so many alliances that and relationships that are crossing the line, and that and then they could at the end control what Venezuela does with oil. Today, probably because of the recent fall of prices, and because of the necessity of bailing out the shale oil producing companies in the United States, it's probably one thing that's key for the United States is to maintain those sanctions in place so that the Venezuelan oil doesn't reach the market and doesn't make the situation worse. So it's key for them to have that control. Politically, yes, we have had problems in Venezuela, and I'm not saying that we haven't. And again, the fall of oil prices have had a strong repercussion for us. But there were things that we were able to we're starting to recuperate and deal with, and we could have even overcome if it weren't for this sanctions war that has been launched against Venezuela. And also internally, the discussion or the conversation between the political forces, the political actors in Venezuela is probably closer right now to an understanding that has ever been between government and opposition. But it's this one element of the opposition that is the group that is controlled by Juan Guaido, that is together with all these other four main political parties, who take their directives directly from Washington, and they have been blocking over and over any idea of dialogue within this country. You have people in the opposition now criticizing them, criticizing the idea that they're calling for an invasion of Venezuela to overthrow the government, criticizing criticizing the sanctions and all these policies that hurt all of the people of Venezuela, and not just the government. And you have a lot of people of the opposition that are willing, that want to come back and be part of politics and play politics, and resolve our disputes politically. But at the end of the day, it is this one group that is controlled by Washington, and is basically Washington that doesn't allow real dialogue to take place between Venezuelans. So once, if there was really a concern about the Venezuelan people, if there was really a concern about political dialogue in Venezuela, it's the United States that has to step aside, not President Maduro, not Chavismo. It's the United States that has to step aside and allow for the opposition to have real political engagement with us. I'll leave it at that, and we can discuss more things afterwards.
Thank you, Carlos, for excellent presentation and very informative. I'm sure a lot of people have a lot of questions about what's happening inside Venezuela and about the whole relationship in Latin America. So we're going to be moving toward question answer, but before that, I would like to ask my dear colleague and comrade, Ajamu Baraka, to make a few comments. He is the national organizer for Black Alliance for Peace, member of the executive committee of the U.S. Peace Council, member of the leadership body of UNAC, and member of the steering committee of Black is Black Coalition. Ajamu, please.
Thank you, Comrade Bahman, and thank the organizers for pulling this together. And of course, thank Carlos Ron for that insightful presentation. I'm not going to belabor the points long. I do want to make a few very quick comments, and I will be speaking from the perspective, the point of view of the Black Alliance for Peace, and from my individual point of view. One thing that struck me about the situation that Carlos shared with us was that when you look at the fact that the intensification of the attempt to try to undermine the Bolivarian process intensified under the Obama administration, and when you look at the fact that most of the leading Democrats shared that position to undermine the democratic and revolutionary process in that country. What it suggests, my friends, is that from the point of view of those of us who understand what's really in stake with this international struggle among the oppressor states and the oppressed, that in November, it really does not matter who sits in the white people's house. That basically, as it relates to the objective situation in Venezuela and the imperialist project, it's all going to be the same. And so we need to understand that basically there is a logic in place here. And while we support the attempts on the part of our friends in Venezuela to engage in their process, we had no comments about that process of engagement among the opposition forces, conversations. From our point of view, outside of that process, and as citizens of empire, well, we have to acknowledge and understand that our responsibility, our task, is to engage in struggle, understanding that the objective logic of imperialism is such that they are completely committed to undermining that project in that country. And let me just quote real quickly from our dear friend, Samir Amen, African political economist. He says, the imperialist countries of the historic West do not intend to allow other emerging states to emancipate themselves from the framework imposed by them and to leave the status quo being dominated peripheries. The tension between the West and Russia, China, Iran is not a passing phenomenon, but the epicenter of a new violent remodeling of the world for the benefit of the Western bourgeoisie. That is the objective logic of imperialism. When you look at the evolution of the events with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, it was quite clear that US decision makers understood from their point of view that in the 21st century, this was going to be a century of US hegemony, a century of armed hegemony on the part of the US. They even created doctrines like the notion that they could fight two simultaneous wars. And that's what got them into the trouble in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Two conflicts they in fact lost, and that's why they then moved to the use of proxy forces as a consequence of those actions. And it's also why they moved toward the use of sanctions, that as it became quite clear that they could not deploy US forces directly on the ground because of the potential opposition and because of the impact they had on the US military, they rely more on their proxy forces in the so-called Middle East. Which brings us to us, those of us who are in the US, our responsibilities as citizens and residents of empire. We have to confront and defeat left opportunism, the tendency on the part of the liberal left and even some left forces to identify with and in fact objectively support through silence or non-opposition the project of US imperialism. We have to confront this notion that those of us in the West have some God-given right to be able to judge another process and to determine whether or not we oppose US intervention based on our supposed understanding of what may be unfolding internally in those countries. So we have to deal with our own inability to understand that the relationship between oppressed nations and oppressor nations still remains. And we have to determine and understand what our responsibility must be within that international configuration. So my friends, what that says is that understanding that the object is to destroy the process in Venezuela. And that process is directed toward Venezuela because the gangsters that run US policy and control the US state, they understand that if you undermine Venezuela, you're undermining Latin America. They understand the connection between the Bolivarian project in Venezuela and the connection with Cuba and with Nicaragua. They've already been successful in reversing the process in Bolivia and in Ecuador. they were able to execute a constitutional coup, if you will, in Brazil. So we've got to understand the terms of struggle. Understand it's about the international balance of forces, and that our responsibility is to oppose U.S. imperialism along with their European flunky allies. That's our responsibility, and that's what we intend to do.
Thank you, Ajamu.
Over.
Thank you. I would like to turn the whole control over to Margaret, who is going to be moderating this second half of our meeting. Margaret?
Great, thank you so very much, Bahman, and thank you to all of our panelists. That was really excellent. So what I want to do is follow on what Ajamu said and give some ideas that people can use or actions that people can take to oppose the US imperialism and be in solidarity with Venezuela. And then we'll start the question and answer. A few folks have already written some questions in the chat and also in the Q&A. And if you take your cursor to the bottom of your Zoom screen, then you will see where the chat and Q&A icons are. Click on those and we'll try to ask the questions that you write down there. But first, let me just go through some things. So, you know, we're in an information war, really. In the United States, what we hear in the corporate media, in our experience, is usually the direct opposite of what's actually happening in Venezuela. And so we, as people who understand what's going on and understand this imperialist propaganda, need to take responsibility for countering that narrative. So every time you see something in the corporate media about Venezuela, it's important to question it. There are media sources that you can go to get information of what's actually happening in Venezuela. One of those is the Alliance for Global Justice, afgj.org. They do Venezuelan solidarity email regularly with links to articles. At popularresistance.org, we try to be vigilant about countering the narratives in the corporate media. There are also outlets that are from Venezuela, reporting from Venezuela. One of those is Venezuela Analysis. Another is Misión Verdad, which is now on medium.com, and they've lost their website. And then a third one is the Orinoco Tribune. And what I will do is send an email out to everyone who registered for the call with the same information that I'm giving, so that you don't have to be worried if you didn't catch that name quickly enough. So it's important to go to these sources and try to counter the narrative. If you see it in an article online, make a comment in the comment section. If you see anything on social media, respond to it. And also, you know, in general, in your social media and your conversations, one of the things that people talked to us about when we were in Venezuela is how important it is for us to lift up the positive things that people have done in Venezuela. Instead of constantly trying to counter the lies, sometimes we need to be talking about how, despite the economic war, they've been able to build 3 million units of social housing, how they've been able to provide food to millions of families through the CLAP program, how they provide education and healthcare to people. So, you know, we need to lift that up, because those are examples of things we should be doing in the United States that we're not doing. Another thing that you can do is to educate your members of Congress. They are mainly hearing from the corporate media and the wealthy Venezuelan pro-coup people in the United States who actively lobby them for US intervention and economic warfare. So they need to hear that people in the United States have a different view of what's happening in Venezuela. And so talk to them in whatever way you can, write to them, meet with them, use social media, but we need to reach them more loudly than the opposition, so that they understand that what they're doing, you know, is in violation of international law. The economic war, the military interventions, the interference in their elections that the US does, all of this is illegal. Another thing that we can do is to show our solidarity with Venezuela. And it's hard right now that we're, you know, all stuck in our houses, but we've launched a campaign with other organizations that have also co-sponsored this event. And it's a hashtag Fight COVID, Not Venezuela. we're asking people to take a photo of, have a photo of themselves taken, or take one of yourself holding a sign that has a message about Venezuela, and then spread that out on social media using the hashtag #FightCovid, not Venezuela. Another thing that we can do in this time is we can do online rallies using Zoom. We can have large rallies in solidarity. We can invite people from Venezuela, from the social movements there, to join us and to speak about, so that we can understand what's actually happening in the country. We can also do Twitter storms where we, all together at one time, we spread these messages out so that they're amplified and many people can hear them. A fourth thing that we can do is that in the end of May, there's going to be an International Week of Actions. And this was called from the Anti-Imperialism Conference in Cuba last November. And so it's May 25th to May 31st. People can organize whatever type of action you're capable of doing. We've seen people already doing car caravans in solidarity with Venezuela. Shout out to Northampton, Massachusetts for the one that they just did recently. We can do online rallies. We can do social media types of activities. Hopefully we'll be able to actually be out in the streets together at that point, but we'll see. And so that's May 25th to May 31st. There is an international website, antiimperialist.org. And in the United States, we have a coalition called Sanctions Kill, and you'll also find the information there at sanctionskill.org. And then finally, the last thing is that's important for us in the United States to connect with Venezuelan social movements. And in the past, Venezuela has held many excellent conferences where US activists and other activists go to Venezuela, see what's actually happening, make connections, and we continue to stay in touch with the people that we met in Venezuela when we were there last year. And you can do the same thing. We use WhatsApp. It's easy to communicate with folks in Venezuela using that platform. And then hopefully that will happen again someday, but if not, until then, we can invite people from social movements to join us. And one social movement in Venezuela that we're in touch with quite a bit is the Committee on Solidarity, International Solidarity and Fight for Peace, COSI International. And so you can find them on Facebook, COSI Venezuela. Sorry, it's COSI Venezuela. And then just finally, I want to mention the Manitos Children's Fund. This is a project launched by a number of people that Alliance for Global Justice is helping to spearhead. And this is a program to raise awareness and funds to provide direct material support to the people of Venezuela, particularly around food. And we're asking people to form solidarity committees in their community. Do it through your social groups, your community groups, your churches, to talk about how the US economic warfare has a direct impact on the people in Venezuela and how we can raise money to provide food aid to them. So I'll stop there. And then why don't we take some questions? So I have a few questions that were asked in the chat. And let me see if I can get Carlos's microphone unmuted. There we go. And I'll just unmute Ajamu and, well, Kevin and Ajamu, you can mute yourselves and unmute yourselves if you want to make a comment as well. So the first question for you, Carlos, is why can't the Venezuelan authorities just arrest Juan Guaido?
Well, on that issue specifically, we do, believe it or not, despite the campaign against us, we do have separation of powers, and it is something that is on the judicial branch to take care of, both the judicial and the citizen branch, because the attorney general is in the citizen branch. Basically, they have to move forward with the accusations on Guaido, and the judicial system has to move forward in that sense, so that they prosecute them. And so, I think that that is something that despite whatever personal beliefs we have, we respect the system and its actions. I do want to comment on something before moving on to the questions, so that I think is important in the issue of what to do. And I think I just want to throw out a couple ideas to you, because I think it's important. They are simple enough that they may seem obvious, but sometimes they're not. And I think there's three issues basically. That something that would help the conversation is focusing on three issues that I think would help us would help change or would be what we wish for, so that we could change the tone of the relationship of the aggressions and so forth. First of all, there has to be a clear opposition to any military intervention against Venezuela. And this is not something that I would say, this is not something only because of how it would affect us in Venezuela, but obviously it does have consequences for the United States as well. And for, it's American soldiers that are going to go and put their lives at risk. It's American lives that are going to get lost. But it's also a huge investment with regards to resources that is being wasted. For example, this deployment. I was looking at so somebody gave me information on 1 hour of flight from this radar planes that they're now bringing to the Caribbean, so they can basically harass Venezuelan radars. 1 hour flight is about $38,000. I mean, that's the cost of one of these planes flying for an hour. I mean, how much does it cost for one of these ventilators to be activated for a day in a intensive care unit? It's about $2,000, $3,000. I mean, imagine how many you can employ, if those resources were actually going to attending the health crisis, and not for this show that they wanted to do against Venezuela. I mean, everything that's related to a military intervention is terrible. And not only from our perspective, or from the U.S. perspective. The other issue that I think is important to also keep in mind is the sanctions. This is a policy that doesn't work. And you could tell, even to those people that have differences with the Venezuelan government and don't share our ideology, and then don't want to look. There's no country that I know of where sanctions have been used in any form and that's been somewhat successful to the aims of forcing a government to do something different. On the contrary, you have many countries that have resisted this sanctions. But besides that, it's immoral in the sense that you're attacking a whole population. You're attacking a whole population in order to get rid of a couple of people that you don't like and that are heading a government. This is criminal. This actually is not only criminal, but we have taken this to International Criminal Court, and we are promoting a case where the people responsible for the foreign policy of the United States should be tried to see if they are committing crimes against humanity, because these sanctions are a form of collective punishment against all Venezuelans. So this policy is outdated, it doesn't work, and it's criminal. And the last thing that I would say, as a Venezuelan, we're not asking, and I don't ask any of you to support, the Bolivarian revolution, to support President Maduro, to believe in the same things that I believe in. But I need you to respect my beliefs. And I need you to respect the beliefs of everybody in Venezuela that voted for President Maduro. And we need you all, we need the United States to respect Venezuela's, democracy. That entails, if we're having discussions between government and opposition, some of the opposition group, we moved so far as to start the process of electing a new electoral council, which is in the Constitution. We have elections that should be, now it's complicated because obviously of, how all the quarantine and all these issues are coming up that were obviously not, imagined before. But we have elections that should take place this year for the National Assembly. And there was agreements between Venezuela, between the government and most of the opposition parties into how to enter the process of these elections and the new electoral board and everything. But it's this one small group headed by Guaido that is blocking it. And it's not Guaido, it's the United States is blocking it at the end of the day. So if again, the problem here is that Venezuela needs to be able to make its own decisions, whether they're good or bad, whether you like them or not. It's not the U.S. It's not for the U.S. to determine what happens in Venezuela. It's for Venezuelans to do so. I think these are three basic, very basic points that many people can agree with. This, no matter for a wide range of positions, and that I think are key to really, developing a productive conversation.
Great, thank you. And I forgot to mention one other action that people can take. Please sign the open letter that we have to the United States government and to the United Nations, calling for an end to the economic measures, the coercive economic measures that the U.S. is imposing on Venezuela and many countries. You can find that at uspeacecouncil.org and also at popularresistance.org. So the next question, and we have quite a few of them, is one of the reasons for the accusations of drug smuggling an attempt to keep the funds frozen indefinitely in a quasi-legal way?
Sure, but I think that is one of the ideas. But I think also is that it's something that's easier to sell to the public. When it's not the same thing that you're saying you have a person in government that you don't like, as opposed to a drug trafficker, and it's easy to sell this narrative of these people are trying to poison our children, and this whole boogeyman kind of position. But let me tell you something. In Venezuela, drug interdiction has actually increased after 2005, which when we kicked the DEA out, and we have had the average. We averaged something about 34 tons a year of seizures, until the DEA left, and now it went up 44% afterwards, every year. And we've caught kingpins, and about 21% of those, about 21% of those have gone to the United States. I mean, we handed them over to U.S. authorities because they were being sought after by the U.S. We've handed 48% of those kingpins to Colombian authorities in the last 10 years or so. I mean, we've had much more achievements in fighting drugs after the DEA left than before. So to try to pin down on Venezuela and on the government this idea that this is run by a narco state, and this is not only false, it's an excuse again to maybe rally some sort of support. I mean, it's very difficult also in Congress. It's very difficult for somebody to say they support. If anybody was to come out and say, well, you should lift the sanctions in Venezuela, and they're gonna say, yeah, but you want to lift sanctions against drug trafficking criminals, so it makes it difficult for anybody to actually oppose those policies because you have this, this accusation. But at the end of the day, these are bogus accusations. They present, very questionable proof. Also, they do it in a way, why now? Why in the middle of a pandemic? I mean, they say, oh, we had all this proof all these years. Oh, when they decided to do it now, when they think that is the moment that the government, the Venezuelan government is at its weakest point. And also because they're trying to send a message there and saying to the military, we're going to go after you too if you don't stop supporting Maduro. This is an intimidation. This is a part of an intimidation attempt against the Venezuelan military in order to force them to overthrow the government.
Thank you. The next question is, why is the opposition willing to work with the government?
Because I think there's part of the opposition that believes that, you know, we have differences, but we don't want to see our country, you know, starved or, you know, invaded. And you know, there's a lot of things. Obviously, there, you know, democracies are like that. You have different viewpoints, and you have different policies, and you know, you aim to discern that through elections. But the problem is that you have this one group that is blocking it for everybody else.
Thank you. And then another question is, how can the Venezuelan government fight the inflation that's happening there?
Well, different. I mean, it's been a challenge. You know, we've had different types of policies implemented during the last couple of years, but you know, the attack is vicious. You know, there's a lot of currency manipulation that comes even from outside. You know, right now we're, you know, suffering. You know, there's websites that will, you know, place a price on the dollar that is not based on any actual market transaction, but it's, you know, just in order to generate this tension inside the country, and you know, people to buy it at that price, and then to have to affect the economy. You know, we've tried different things, and every time that we seem that we're, you know, moving forward or achieving something, then we get harsher sanctions on that make it more difficult to stabilize the economy. So this is definitely something that, you know, we could be able to address without, you know, the blocking of oil income or, you know, things of the sort.
Thank you. And I want to remind let our viewers know that there's a Venezuelan economist, Pasqualina Curcio, who does some great writing on this. A related question is, how could the petro, which is pegged to oil, be affected by the oil crude prices crash?
Mm.
You're frozen a little bit. Did you hear what I said?
Well, petro is initially pegged to oil, but there's also other commodities that it's tied to. It's not just yes. So let me start again. Petro is not only tied to oil, but also to a set of other commodities as well. You know, it's other things that we produce in Venezuela. So the price is not completely dependent on oil, because it was assigned that way so that we wouldn't have you know, a strong hit if only one of those sectors was attacked at one time. So you know, it obviously it will get hurt a little bit because of the falling prices, but it's not going to destroy it. You know, there's other things that can help balance out.
Great. And then the next question is, can you talk about the role of the communes and of Afro-Venezuelans in the Bolivarian process? I think you're frozen again. Are you there, Carlos?
Yeah, well, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm here. Hello? Yes?
Yes.
So what I'm saying is, I think we have a, you know, a very, I mean, it'll give us about a whole other hour to talk about this. But, you know, Afro-Venezuelans have definitely played an important role at the revolution, not only because they have been recognized by the revolution in you know, the way the political approach to the community, but also because they're an essential part of the revolution in their community organizations, in the way that they, you know, they push forward a lot of the programs, the social programs in the revolution, and also making up the communes. The communes are, you know, basically self-governing instances within the physical structure. Even now with the pandemic, they've been a very they've played a very important role in supporting prevention. And the first thing I know one of the communes here close by in Panal, the first thing they did immediately when the COVID-19 started was, set their own textile production. It was, masks for people to use and distribute it within the community so that people would be able to have them and take care of themselves. So communes are the future of this. What President Chavez asked for us to, have the most concern about, and I think it's the most democratic process that there is. The construction of these communes. Every one of them has their own characteristics, but it really entails popular participation and democratic self-governance. And I think that this is the basis under which we need to really, build for the revolution to last as long as as we need to feel the real space for direct democracy here in Venezuela. And it's important that they keep playing the such an important role that have.
Whoops, it looks like we lost Carlos. Are you still there?
I'm here.
Okay, we hear you again.
Yes.
Okay, let's go to the next question. A lot of people are asking how Venezuela is doing in the COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay.
Are you there?
Look, we're going to get on a next update about 7 o'clock at night. So I'll tell you, from the last. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I was saying that we're going to get on our next update in about an hour or so, less than an hour. But last night we had 298 cases. We had 10 people that have lost their lives with the pandemic. But we have over 50% of people that have been recovered so far. And the reason we have these is because we're able to take very early measures. Even before we started take the rest of the even before we had our first case, and even before some of our neighboring countries. So we were able to help contain the virus and contain its spread. We have, through our Patria system, which is the online database where we register for social programs, we're conducting surveys to identify who are people at risk, and then since we have a spread out local community medicine outposts, we're able to send the community doctors to the zones or to the people that we have identified as high risk, to test them, to trace if they had any contact with somebody that was infected, and to try to keep. And people have really it's been hard, but I think people have mostly joined the quarantine and try to take care of themselves. And I think there's a constant. One of the good things about having communes and organized social movements is that there's forceful tell them what the risks are, make sure that they take the necessary, make everything harder for us, and makes it more costly for us to purchase some equipment or to gain access to some medicine. We have been able to work with the solidarity of China, of Russia, of Cuba, with the multilateral organizations like the World Health Organization, which have been able to provide for us test kits, masks, the equipment necessary to prevent contagion. So that way we were able to do this and keep low numbers, and also we were able to take some measures that have been important for the economy and for people in this moment of quarantine. And for example, there was the suspension of rent payments, both for residential and commercial buildings. We've suspended loan payments. We've decided that we were going to strengthen the loans to specific sectors, the production of agriculture and food production, pharmaceuticals and other hygiene products, so that these sectors will especially be strengthened during this time. And we've taken other measures like suspending or prohibiting the suspension of utilities, gas, water, electricity, telecommunications. None of these can be cut off if at least for the next 6 months or until the crisis passes. It is important that we do this to help our people take care of themselves. And small businesses, for example, are also getting the support from the government to take care of their payrolls while this crisis continues, because we know it's a hard hit for restaurants, for small businesses that are trying to that need constant people to come and move their economy. So we're trying to take these measures in order to ease the impact on the people, and we take the precautions. Classes suspended, no large gatherings, no movie theaters, and nothing to that effect. You see me, I'm working here from home. I only go to the office when it's strictly necessary, and we're trying to keep it at that level.
Great. We only have about 8 more minutes for questions. We do have folks on from Canada, and we want to welcome our colleagues from Canada. Yes. The question is 2 questions: the relationship now between China, Russia, and Venezuela, and speak more directly about Canada and Venezuela, especially the Canadian mining interests in the country, Crystallex, Rusaro, and Gold Reserve. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, with the issue with Canada, again, it's also a very tough relationship. With Canada, we've had, if you think the diplomatic relationship with the U.S. has been tough, with Canada has been even more difficult to open channels of communication. I, as vice minister, was never able even to go to Canada to, even to meet with them to discuss with their authorities, where they recognized some other person as ambassador. So we have, these conflicts. They've left Venezuela. We haven't broken relations like with the United States, but they have taken all the diplomatic personnel away from Venezuela. And again, I think there's a lot of influence, not only because of some of the mining companies that have feuded with the Venezuelan government, like Crystallex that was mentioned, but I think there's also a group that is trying to get some advantage out of the fact that Venezuela's oil is banned from the United States, because the 3 refineries that we have, the silver refineries that we had in the United States, in Texas and Louisiana, they're equipped to deal with heavy crude, which is produced in Venezuela, and it's a very specific type of oil that can get processed there. And once we lost that the possibility of sending it to Venezuela, it was oil from Alberta that replaced at least 1/3 of that quota. that was being processed in the U.S. So I think there's also oil interests in Canada that they're, so that Venezuela, so that these sanctions and this tension between between Venezuela and the United States is maintained. It's very unfortunate. We have a lot of friends in Canada as well. We wish that we could establish a strong relationship with more progressive elements in Canada, and hopefully find a way also to dialogue with other political forces. But it's difficult because we have limited presence in Canada, and we have these difficulties of traveling there and being there. Again, we do thank all our friends that are constantly there standing up for Venezuela, and we hope that we can strengthen that relationship every day. Oh, and on the issue of China and Russia, no, we've had a very good relationship with them. Even Russia today came out with a wonderful statement, the foreign minister from the foreign ministry, again saying that this plan, this transition plan by the U.S. Was basically, there's nothing that could come out of something that is imposed by the U.S. Whatever solutions have to come directly from the Venezuelan people. And Russia has been very, very strong and clear about their belief that it is up to Venezuelans to solve their own problems. China has done so as well, and they continue to provide for us, the solidarity and the cooperation that we need. And we've developed very strong ties, and I think it's important because at the end of the day, something that the U.S. establishment hasn't, in sort of very arrogant way, hasn't been able to understand is that when China, for example, comes with a cooperation, attempt of cooperation, it's not trying to impose on Venezuela, what policy we have to make, or what type of government we have to have, or who do we have to have as president or not. And as opposed to the United States, which wants to dictate everything that you do and how you do it. So I think that is why not only Venezuela, but that is why other countries in the region have seen China and Russia as alternatives for cooperation, where the U.S. basically, lost that role.
I have a question for Ajamu, and then one final question for you, Carlos. So Ajamu, a couple people have asked these questions about why should African Americans struggling in urban and rural communities across the United States care about U.S. policy in Venezuela? How do we as African Americans who support the Bolivarian Revolution get our people to see the connection between their struggle and that of the people of Venezuela? And why are these international actions at the end of May an issue that working people should care about? So those are all kind of related.
Thank you for that question. I think it's a very important one, but I think a question that I'm sure that the questioner already knew the answer. That basically we see as the Black Alliance for Peace that we are part of a global system, that it is the colonial capitalist system that's responsible for the plight of African people in North America, for the plight that people around the world who are struggling for national liberation and self-determination face. And therefore, we understand that as oppressed people, we have a responsibility to take an internationalist stance. That if we are part of one oppressive system, then we understand that that system will express itself in national terms. So in our case, dealing with the situation within the US. But what that also says to us, being in the US and reflecting the fact that the US is the leading imperialist nation, it renders certain objective responsibilities we have, not only to ourselves, but to the people of the world. And so we take on the US. We attempt to try to show our people and others the relationship between the oppression, the capitalist oppression in the US and imperialism abroad. We understand, and we want people to understand that we're not going to be able to defeat imperialism outside of the US without an active, aggressive, militant opposition within the center of empire. Therefore, these struggles are interconnected and interrelated. So as revolutionaries, we have no other choice but to engage in that kind of popular education, organization, and relationship building among ourselves and between ourselves and struggling oppressed people globally. And that's why we say that is our responsibility, and indeed the responsibility of most people in the US to take up the task to confront and to defeat the US state that has now exposed itself and its system as being the number one contradiction, the number one issue, the number one threat to international peace that faces collective humanity.
Thank you. And then the final question, Carlos, for you is a number of people have asked, what are some of the important things that people in the United States can do to show solidarity with Venezuela?
Oh, I think you guys were on the right track when you mentioned the issue of just spreading the information of what's really going on in Venezuela is key. I think it's the basis for us to continue, because when if people don't understand what's going on, then there's not going to be any solidarity. I think it's speaking out, and again, calling attention to what people are doing, and not only for the sake of Venezuela, but for the sake of the people in the United States as well. There was just this afternoon there was an article that came out basically saying, Guaido has been promising doctors, one of his populist type of lies to the people here. He's been promising doctors that he's going to set up a fund, and they're going to give him like $100 a month bonus and all this stuff. So that is probably not viable in any way possible. But he's saying that. But there's a news story broke out today saying that this is money that they're taking from either from Venezuelan accounts, or they're taking from U.S. Grant, the support, the U.S. aid, and all that's going to him. And there's millions of dollars flowing to Guaido that nobody knows what's going on with that money, and this is U.S. taxpayer money. And then the story we got saying, well, that not only, yes, there was a fund that was supposed to set up for $100 for doctors. But the same approval, they decided to pay themselves, the people of the National Assembly that support Guaido, they decided to pay themselves $5,000 a month. So, these are criminals who we're talking about. This is a gang here that is trying to take over the government of Venezuela, and they're doing this with U.S. money. They're not doing it not only with Venezuelan money, but they're doing it with with money that is coming directly from your taxes. So I think you definitely have a legitimate question to ask. Ask U.S. citizens. Why is this money going to these people? Why is this really the best use of our tax dollars, especially in a situation like the one we are in today? No, I think you guys and I'm always careful. I really can't tell you what to do. And I shouldn't, because you have there's a lot of issues through that. But we appreciate all the solidarity that you have with us. We appreciate all that you've all done remarkable feats, to show that you believe in defending democracy in Venezuela. You believe in Venezuela's right to self-determination. That you believe in upholding international law and not seeing your country involved in a violation of that and of human rights. So I think that's it. I mean, I think that's really the way of doing this. The best way of showing support for Venezuela is letting us know that you care about us.
Thank you. That's a fantastic way to end.
Margaret, can I make a point?
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
I've just been watching the chat box, and people are asking a lot about Julian Assange and about other countries and suggesting we do other webinars. Earlier today, when I talked about this Venezuelan webinar, people from Nicaragua wanted us to cover Nicaragua as well, which is also under U.S. attack, and for there's even more lies about Nicaragua than Venezuela. Just last week, they were claiming Daniel Ortega was dead, and he gave a speech that called for peace and not conflict, and so it was just absurd. And people want to see a webinar on Julian Assange. So if people have ideas for webinars and want to help organize them, I hope they'll contact Popular Resistance. During this phase of staying at home, it's a great time for us to build up our knowledge and educate each other, because that is the foundation of movements. And I think Carlos is so right about the importance of, and Ajamu and all of us on this are saying the importance of solidarity. We've got to stop the United States from being a bully, which Ajamu describes as gangsterism. And I think we need to stop that. And it's our job as people in the United States to do that. It's a challenging thing because it's a deep foreign policy, but that is our job. But if you want to see other webinars, please contact Popular Resistance and say so. And we'll be contacting you after this to let you know give you some links to some of the materials that we've talked about. Thank you all very much for attending.
Thank you for that, Kevin. Yes, so I wanted to thank everybody who participated today, all of our attendees, and to those who are watching it on Facebook. We apologize for some of the interruptions. We finally got that straightened out, but we are recording this and we will post the full video on YouTube, so you can go to our Popular Resistance YouTube channel. I want to thank all of the organizations who co-sponsored this webinar, the Black Alliance for Peace, the U.S. Peace Council, Code Pink, the United National Anti-War Coalition, the Alliance for Global Justice, the International Action Center, and the Sanctions Kill Coalition. I want to thank our panelists and especially Carlos for taking time to speak with us today. And I'm sorry that we couldn't get to everybody's questions. They were excellent questions, and we will definitely do more of these. So please contact us at info@popularresistance.org if you have other ideas for webinars, and I will be getting an email out to you shortly with information that we've talked about on this call. So thank you very much, everyone, for participating today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you.
Thank you.